Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third and final NAGCAST of 2014. It's hard to believe we're already at the end of the year and time to wish everyone a happy holidays. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Steve Toole, and I'm the Director of the State of North Carolina Retirement Systems, and I'll be the moderator for today's webcast. Let me make sure I advance the slides here. So we have just a few announcements before the presentation begins. First, NAGDA certainly could not offer the 2014 NAGDCAST series to participants without the financial support of our industry. Those sponsors include great companies like Siegel, Nationwide, Charles Schwab, ICMA RC, Prudential, Valic, MassMutual, and TIAA-CREF. We are certainly grateful for the support of these industry sponsors. We want to let you know about a few housekeeping items. First, please remain muted throughout the call so the presentation isn't interrupted. At the end of the presentation, there will be a question and answer period. Throughout the call, you can submit questions through your web console there on the right. Simply locate the question and answer panel on the top right-hand side of your screen. Type your question in the open area, and then just click Send to Submit, and then we will take a look at those at the end of the session. The PowerPoint presentation for today's webcast has been posted to NAGDA website. If you want to have a hard copy of the PowerPoint in front of you and have not yet downloaded it, you can access it on the NAGDA webpage at www.nagda.org by clicking on the News and Events image, and the PowerPoint is the top link under NAGDA News. Today's NAGCAST is worth one continuing education credit for INFRI, the CRA, CRC, the CFP, and CPE designees. NAGDA will provide INFRI with a list of all participants. If you will be seeking credits, you must have registered with your contact information and be logged into the webcast using your information. Individuals from the same venue that will be seeking credits must all participate separately. NAGDCAST participants seeking CPE continuing education credits must complete the polling questions during the webcast to receive credit. Finally, we really need your input on how we did this NAGDCAST and what we can do to improve. So at the end, when you exit the webcast, a very quick, easy to answer NAGDCAST evaluation will open up in your browser window. We ask that you take an additional 2 to 3 minutes to complete the survey so we can determine if we're on the right track with these types of programs and adjust accordingly. Our speakers today are Jeffrey H. Snyder, CAMAC Retirement Group, there on the left, and Martha Spano with Buck Consultants. With that said, let's get to today's agenda, the main event, and today's webcast will give you an overview of the NAGDA Best Practices Guide section on plan design. First up is Jeffrey Snyder.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm not sure if everyone heard me. I think I started before I was unmuted. This is Jeff Snyder with CAMAC Retirement Group. Thank you very much for joining us on this final NAGCAST. Thank you to the folks at NAGDA and to all the sponsors as well, and to my fellow panelists. I think this is a very important topic. Obviously, best practices, sharing best practices across organizations, entities is important to creating a better retirement system. And so what we've got in terms of the presentation is we've broken it down into a few key areas. I'll be covering participant services and plan features, and Martha will really focus on the investment side of the equation. So you can see from this overview, we'll touch on participant services, in particular hardship and unforeseeable emergency withdrawals, loans, investment advice and guidance, and then plan features, rollovers, Roth options, automatic plan features, and employer match. Steve talked to you a little bit about how do you submit a question. I think I speak for the panel. When we like the interaction, we want the question. So if you think of something, feel free to write it down, and we can have a conversation at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, let me kind of launch into talking about hardship and unforeseeable emergency withdrawals. And let me just preface this by saying that as administrators, as people who are responsible for retirement plans, you're presented with many different challenges and tasks. You're responsible for the day-to-day administration of the plan, or at least coordinating it, and you're also responsible for making sure that participants or employees are kept satisfied, as well as other dealing with other complex issues. So in terms of a particular provision, hardship and unforeseen emergency withdrawals are a critical component, or could be considered a critical component of a defined contribution retirement plan. When you look at the hardship withdrawal in particular, this element, this plan design feature, is really a common practice in 401k and 403b plans. And many of you have the distinction, the privilege, I guess, so to speak, or the responsibility to oversee many different types of plans. 401a, 401k, 403b, etc. But really, the key tenets around hardship withdrawal is that you're allowing a participant, an employee, to withdraw monies from the plan if they have an immediate and heavy need. And this is really outside of what we're going to discuss next, which is the typical loan provision. And the Internal Revenue Service has ascribed specific reasons for which you can take a withdrawal, and they're called safe harbor reasons. There are really 5. There's medical expenses, buying a principal residence, so it can't be that summer home that you always wanted, tuition and educational expenses for you or a dependent, payment to avoid eviction or foreclosure from your home, and then one that's not printed here is burial expenses for you or someone close to you. What's also important is that early distribution penalties apply to 401k and 403b for participants who take hardships under age 59 and a half. And that's important because that's very different than the rules that apply to 457b. So, what's important to know here is that, you can do, in terms of the safe harbor, there's a little bit of administration that's required. It's determining whether or not the hardship submitted by an employee meets one of these reasons, and you can either do it yourself as an administrator, or you can have a vendor. And it's commonplace that vendors like those that are sponsoring today's NAGDCAST can take on that responsibility as part of their ongoing working with your organization. But it's making sure that it meets the IRS safe harbor reasons, and then if the participant does take a hardship, they're generally suspended for either 6 or 12 months from making employee contributions. Very important, critical component. When you look at the unforeseeable emergency withdrawals, which is a very different element, it's part of the 457B rules and regulations and code, it's a bit more restrictive. And you may ask, well, they have hardship on 401k and 403B, why is it more restrictive with the 457B? And the quick answer is because there's no 59 or 10% penalty for when you take a distribution and you're not age 59 and a half or older, age 59 and a half or older. So there are some restrictions there as it relates to what you can take the unforeseeable emergency for. Illness or accident, loss of property due to casualty, and other similar extraordinary or unforeseeable circumstances due to events beyond control. What's really important here, besides knowing the rules, is to make sure that you have clear and consistent policies and procedures on hand. And again, many of you take on this responsibility of determining whether or not a withdrawal is prudent and follows either the IRS rules as it relates to hardship or for the unforeseeable rules. If not, you're partnering with a third-party administrator. But it's important to have clear and consistent policies, both for you in terms of processing and making sure that they're processed on time, but also so that participants understand or employees understand on the ground rules. Another key provision that was summarized in the best practices document is around loans. And loans are another key feature of most retirement plans, not only 457B, but also 401k and 403B. And the reason why loans are included is to be able to give participants, employees, access to their money, fairly easy access to their money, because a lot of times participants don't like having their money locked up for long periods of time, and so they want to have access in case they need it. There are generally two types of loans. The first is a general purpose loan. So, you don't necessarily have to have if you want to buy take it out for tuition expense, if you need it to cover your mortgage or something like that. And then you've got a principal residence loan. The key difference there for the principal residence, you can go, a traditional loan is about 5 years in term. Principal residence can go out up to 20 years. The IRS statute for borrowing money is 50% of your vested account balance or $50,000 or the lesser of. And if you have a 403B plan or if you have multiple vendors, it's that 50,000 or 50% of the vested account balance, whichever is less, applies across all vendors. So if you have multiple vendors and the participants in one, or in two, they don't get to have $50,000 from vendor A and $50,000 from vendor B. So it puts a bit more restriction or more emphasis on oversight on the part of the administrator. In terms of best practices, what is outlined in the best practices document is we see the number of loans taken restricted. And that could be anywhere from 2 to 5 loans. Generally speaking, though, it's about 2 to 3 loans. So allowing participants to have 2 to 3 loans outstanding at one time. The other best practice is for a participant initiating a loan, there's generally a administrative fee. So there's an initiation fee that occurs. $50, $75, $100. It sometimes varies it varies by vendor or third-party administrator. And that is designed to offset the cost of administering the loan. It can be very complex. There are specific rules around making sure that people have made their loan payments on time, and that they're in terms of their amortization schedule. And it's to make sure that in reality, charging a fee to discourage loan use. What's also important to know about loans, when the participant takes a loan, what's commonplace is that repayment is done through payroll deduction. So let's just hypothetically say that a participant calls up the record keeper, third-party administrator, takes a loan. That third-party record keeper would send a loan amount and a payment amount and the number of payments to the entity's payroll. The payroll team would load this information and begin taking deductions. So there's a little bit of administrative work that has to happen at the entity, at the government, in the payroll department to make sure that the loans are set up. And then, like I said before, there's a little bit more onus in terms of administration to make sure that people are continuing to make payments and make payments on time. If not, then you're in arrears and you could go into default. So there's some complexity there, not undaunting complexity, but there's complexity there around a loan administration. I think many of you probably read the NAGDA newsletter. I hope you read the NAGDA newsletter, but you're also reading periodicals that talk and have talked about the fact that loans can be detrimental to participant savings. People are taking money out of the plan, they don't pay it back. There's a chance that loans go in default. And this is really an area that regulators and members of Congress and at the federal level are thinking about in terms of preventing leakage, money coming out of the plan. So I think you just want to understand conceptually how loans work if you're not using them today, and understand that it's going to create a little bit need for greater oversight and potentially could have an impact on your participant employee savings rates. Moving forward, another service that I want to speak briefly about that's covered in the Best Practices Guide is something called investment advice. And many of you are probably very familiar with this. It's been around for several years now, and it's typically offered through third-party administrators or financial planners, and it's really helping participants determine the best asset allocation based on their circumstances. So, there are many different ways that advice can be provided. One type of service is called a managed account service. So the record keeper has a call center. The participant decides to enroll, and based on their specific financial need and their circumstances, they get provided advice. And there's a distinction, a legal distinction between advice and guidance. So you get provided advice, and then the participant can choose to act, or they can actually have someone act on their behalf. Additionally, there's one-on-one financial planning sessions. And I think, at our NAGDA event in September, we had the great NAGDA conference, and you recall David Leibson, I think, talking very eloquently about behavior, participant behavior. And I think one of the key themes from NAGDA, the NAGDA annual conference, was how do you get people to do the right thing? This is a tool, a mechanism, investment advice is, for people to help people do the right thing. We're going to talk later about some plan design features around getting people into the plan, but once they're into the plan, how do you make sure that they are diversifying, that they're if they're 20 some odd years old, they're invested in the right split between equities and fixed income to make sure that they're going to achieve a successful retirement. And so, the next bullet basically says it's a tool to improve diversification and reduce total volatility. In selecting and monitoring an investment advice provider, so even if you're working with a third party, not your TPA or your TPA, there's some real key elements that you need to look at as an administrator, as someone who's responsible for his or her plan. Fees. So you want to look at how much does this cost a participant. And you can see costs expressed as a per head charge, like a dollar fee, or a percentage of assets. But it's very important to make sure, and prudent, to make sure that the fees charged to participants are in line. And so it's not just at the time you select the service, it's also doing your due diligence ongoing, a year into using the service. Maybe look at fees annually like you do your other plan fees. Revenue sharing transparency, so making sure that you understand the impact to your plan economics, what you're paying your TPA, what participants are paying. The appropriateness of the asset allocation model that's being used. Every advice provider does things a little bit differently. I mean, there's some consistent areas, but there are some differences. And part of proper due diligence and ongoing proper due diligence is making sure that the model still applies. We all go through, every organization, whether it's a state government, municipal government, goes through demographic shifts. So it's important to take note of participant behavior and make sure that the asset allocation model is still appropriate. I would also say that it's important that the investment advice also incorporates other aspects. Dr. Leibson talked about the big picture. So making sure that you pull in Social Security, the defined benefit plan that you have with the state or the municipality. So making sure that that's all pulled in and reflected in the advice and guidance that's given. And then lastly, the fund selection. What's the process to select the fund that is recommended to the participant? And we could go on and on, and I'm sure hopefully this will generate some questions for the end of our session. Moving forward, I want to talk a little bit about the plan features that were covered in the guide. Rollovers. This is another area that you can enhance your program by allowing other types of qualified plans to be rolled into your plan. So allowing a 401k, a 403b, a 401a, and even an IRA to be rolled in. And what that does is it allows the participant to consolidate. Oftentimes with large municipal plans or large state plans, there's cost benefits. There definitely are cost benefits to being part of a larger program. So if you were with another employer, it is to your benefit in a lot of cases, not all, but in a lot of cases, to be able to consolidate and bring those accounts into your new employer's plan, so the new state government plan that you're working for. So I think it's a great way to allow participants to control their savings, look at the big picture, and again, there are many tools available at TPA websites to pull in all this information. It removes the burden of receiving 8 different statements. If I've worked for 8 different employers and I've worked for 30 years and I've worked for 8 different employers, I may have 8 different accounts. So I think it's a great way to eliminate the paper trail, if you had a statement with company XYZ, keeping track of that and then having to update addresses and make sure everything's updated. So I think that's important. And then lastly, there are new laws that allow Roth funds to be rolled over. So you can bring in Roth money into a 457B or 401K or 403B plan. But that adds additional levels of complexity, specifically taxation, as it relates to the Roth, because Roth is technically considered after-tax money, quote unquote, and needs to be kept track of separately. So rollovers are a great way and considered a best practice to allow participants to consolidate and give themselves a big picture as it relates to their retirement assets. I mentioned before Roth, so there we go. Perfect segue for myself. Roth is a relatively new feature, was part of EGTRA in 2001, was enacted in 2006, and was expanded to 457B several years ago. I don't remember the exact date of the statute. But most governmental plans can add Roth, and it is considered, based on NAGDA's best practice, to consider offering the Roth option when available. But it's important to distinguish between educate yourselves and educate participants about what the differences are between tax-deferred savings and tax-free accumulation on Roth contributions. So there are differences between the Roth 401K, 403B, and 457B from the typical Roth IRA. Many of you are familiar with the Roth IRA. The designated Roth doesn't have income limits. Typically with the designated Roth allows a participant, regardless of their compensation, to contribute up to the maximum, the statutory maximum. And so in 2015, that will be $18,000 can be placed into Roth. But with adding Roth comes additional level of complexity as it relates to administration. You have to make sure that your TPA can set up Roth. That means keeping track of the contributions separately on the record-keeping system to handle the Roth component separately or differently. As you're all aware, perhaps, Roth money is after tax, and so the only thing that gets taxed on distribution is the earnings. And then further, it's important to make sure that not only the TPA has the ability to keep track of this, but also your payroll folks. So you decide to consider adding Roth. You do that, but you got to make sure that your payroll folks can take a separate deduction, because you're going to have your pre-tax deduction, but you're also going to have your Roth deduction. And so that's important. And I think the most important thing about Roth, quite frankly, is around education. I think from a 25,000-foot view, education communication is a key element of defined contribution plans, and in particular, making the decision around Roth, whether or not you're going to do it as a new employee or as an existing employee. It takes a lot of education, a lot of thought before deciding to do so. Next, I want to move to another feature that I want to talk to you about, and this is a feature that's I don't think it's not too typical based on the most recent NAGDA survey. I was part of the survey committee this year. I remember seeing the survey results. Automatic plan features. I mentioned earlier about Dr. Laibson and his work on behavioral finance. Automatic enrollment and auto escalation are features that do go hand in hand, and we typically see them in the corporate and tax-exempt marketplaces, but we don't typically see them in governmental marketplace just yet. And there's a couple reasons for that. I think number one, that a lot of the governmental plans are supplemental plans or voluntary plans, and so it just hasn't kind of filtered down there in terms of philosophically saying, hey, participant, we're going to put you're already in the defined benefit pension plan. Now we're going to put you automatically into the defined contribution plan. So I think that's one thing. But as you all know, because you're part of NAGDA and you are also reading popular press, you're hearing about the shift across the country, or at least consideration of the move to defined contribution plan, even at the governmental level. And I can cite many different examples. I'm sure you're aware of others as well, where at least it's being considered for new employees to consider participating in the DC plan. So auto-enrollment and auto-escalation basically put somebody into the plan automatically. They get hired. You put them in automatically at, say, 3%, which is the typical rate, and then you auto-escalate them year after year up to 1% a year up to 10% a year. And this is a great way to enhance participation rates. When you do this, I think everyone on the call is very familiar with the term inertia, and so this is a great tool potentially to help break through the inertia and get participants to contribute more. But that being said, it's important to look at your state laws and also bargaining agreements to make sure that adding this feature does not conflict. Now, Steve, I do believe that there is and Liz, I do believe that there is a poll question that we want to ask the audience. Oh, there it is. You ask and you shall receive. So here's a poll question, and basically, if your plan doesn't offer auto-enrollment escalation features, why haven't these features been implemented? So you can go ahead, we'll give you a couple seconds, and we'll take a look at the poll results. I kind of feel like I'm on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So everyone's kind of filtering in here, and we see their state and local rules seem to be the key reason, key rationale. Followed, I would say, ever so closely by our plans utilizing auto features. Great. Okay, so you can just see, I'll let everyone else kind of log in. You can or enter your example. You can keep looking at the results. But the bottom line is that there are state or local rules for many of you that may be a challenge. But challenges can be overcome. It's about having conversations, discussing the merits, and quite frankly, as we're moving and seeing the move and shift to DC plans for maybe new employees, this could be a challenge that could be overcome. I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide. And another interesting plan feature is the employer match. I talked about the shift to DC plans, and the employer match is really most common with the use of a hybrid retirement plan. And by retirement, I'm talking defined contribution. So if new employees, as part of your state, you decide to add a hybrid plan, add a defined contribution plan, and make that the mandatory plan, this is where you could see an employer match. The employer match helps incentivize people to participate. So if you match 50% up to the first 6, and you put away 6% as an individual, the entity will give you 3%. It's a great way to incentivize people to participate. It also is a great way to help with additional savings. So we talk about in the previous slide about auto escalation and auto increase. That's another way to kind of get people to contribute. But when you have the employer match, it's additive. So you've got somebody who contributed 6, you're giving them 3, they have a total of 9. That's additive to what they're putting away. The employer match typically is used with a vesting schedule, 3-year cliff, a 5-year grade, and that is used primarily, the reason there is for as a retention tool. So you don't want people to just get the match and then just walk away. So you see typically when an employer match is added that there's some type of graded vesting or a cliff vesting, so you have to work for 3 years in order to get it. There are definitely some rules around match as it relates to FICA and Social Security taxes, and so you would certainly want to speak to counsel about that, internal counsel, and discuss that among your payroll folks as well as any outside counsel that you have. And I think that's it. So I will then now turn things over to Martha to talk about best practices as it relates to investments. Martha?
Okay, thank you, Jeff, for covering all of those features on the administration side. What we're going to do now is sort of change our perspective and look at the investments of the plan. And the first thing I'd like to talk about is the investment policy statement. So the investment policy statement is probably one of the best practices that you can have on the investment side. The IRS doesn't necessarily require you to have one, or the DOL, but the DOL has issued some formal guidance on the use of an investment policy statement, and it's usually one of the first documents they ask for when they do an audit. So in order to create some good investment processes and some good due diligence on the oversight of your managers and your funds, we believe that it is a best practice to have an investment policy statement. So what is an investment policy statement? It really is the roadmap to the operation and oversight of your investments. It lays out the purpose of the plan, it outlines roles and responsibilities, it actually sets up what the investment lineup is going to look like, and performs some performance standards and risk parameters that you're going to use to measure those different funds and different managers. It really is the idea of codifying the standards for managing your plan. And typically you should take a look at your investment policy on an annual basis. Now we'd like to hear from the audience. There's a polling question. How many of you actually do have an investment policy? So Liz, if you could put up that polling question. The answers here are, does your plan have one? Do they not have one? Are they in the process of drafting one? Don't ever intend to use one, or just not sure? And this is really good to see that 100% of the audience at this point in time, well, 95%, actually have. So the majority of you do have an investment policy. That is actually good news. Interesting that we had a couple people talk about don't ever intend to use one, and some are not sure. So one of the things I want to talk about, and we'll leave that up for a few more minutes, as we go through some of the components of an investment policy. So the investment policy really does have a set format. There's the idea that you have the purpose and introduction for both the plan and the investment policy. You can actually put all the different obligations and responsibilities for the people that are involved in the plan, whether it be your consultants, your record keeper, your trustees, all the vendors that you have. You can actually lay out the types of investment options you're going to offer in the plan, and you can outline those options. And many times what the investment policy will do is actually name what the actual investment options are, typically as an exhibit at the end of the investment policy. And the reason people do that is because when you do make a change, you don't necessarily have to change the entire investment policy. You also have investment objectives and standards that you use. And then what we do is we actually set things like, what is your diversification standards going to be? What are the guidelines you're going to use to monitor the managers? Are you going to measure them against certain peer universes? What benchmark they're going to use? You can also put in what we call a watch provision. And it is best practice to have some kind of a watch provision, because when you do have a fund or a manager that's underperforming, you want to have some flexibility to say, we understand there's been some underperformance. What do we want to do about it? We don't necessarily want to replace them right away. We want to see what's going on, maybe perform some due diligence of that fund or manager, and maybe wait 2 or 3 quarters to see if things actually resolve themselves. However, if they don't resolve themselves, then you also want to have provisions for the actual termination of a fund or a manager, and then also what you actually set out as your criteria to actually do the fund selection. So how do you actually go about selecting a new fund or selecting a new manager? Do you look at 3 to 5 different candidates? Do you have them come in and talk to you? These are the types of things you can set out in an investment policy. What I am seeing right now is there's 2 other provisions that a lot of investment policies are doing right now. One of them is to include a fee policy, and that mainly has to do with the fact that there's been so much litigation over fees. So the idea is if you actually are using some revenue sharing in your plan, it's going to set forth some criteria for how you're actually going to look at the fees and how frequently you're going to look at the fees, and also may even talk about how the fees and the revenue sharing are being used. Participant disclosure is another provision, and it's the idea that you're actually going to take a look at the participant disclosure and how that's actually going out to the participants and how they're receiving the disclosure statements. So all in all, we do think that having an investment policy is very good practice. It should be detailed enough to help you manage the plan, but not so detailed as to handcuff any of your decisions. So that's the investment policy statement. The next item we're going to talk about is the fund lineup. So with the fund lineup, one of the things we all recognize is that for a plan to be successful, a defined contribution plan where participants make elections, participants really do need to be engaged. And the problem is that investing is really a challenge for most participants. They are affected by things like decision paralysis. There might be too many funds, so there's too many decisions, too many choices, and in the end they end up doing nothing, or they put all the money in a target date fund, or they put all the money in a stable value fund. There's complacency. Once they make a decision, they don't ever look at it again. They maybe spend 1 hour a year looking at their investments, and they never rebalance their asset allocation. In fact, studies have shown that participants probably spend more time planning their vacation than they do planning their retirement. Then there's also that emotional influence. Many times with the mutual fund complex, participants will buy high and sell low, and they tend to chase performance because they let their emotions kind of dictate. So the biggest challenge for plan sponsors is to offer a menu that is both simple and yet diversified. And that's what's given rise to this idea of the tiered approach. Many plans have embraced the tiered approach. And the idea behind this is that it meets the needs of probably 90% of the participants out there. So at the bottom level, you've got the asset allocation funds, and these include your target date and your target risk funds. And those are for the people that are, basically kind of disengaged. They want you to do it for them. And so you pick a default option and you put them in. The next level up is basically the idea that there are some participants out there that actually want to have some say over their asset allocation. They want to pick among some active core options and some passive core options. And so you can create a number of options to fill that complement. Then the top of this pyramid is actually the self-directed brokerage account. And the idea there is that you've got participants who really want to take full discretion over what they're doing. They want to pick all their funds, they want to do their own asset allocation, and they don't want to be hamstrung basically by, the funds that are in the actual lineup. So this tiered approach has gained a lot of popularity in how we actually put the fund structure together. When we asked NAGDA members in our survey back in March how many core options they provided in their plan, what we found is that there were funds out there that had 10, 20, even 30 or 50 core funds in here, and that's not counting the target date or the target risk funds. So you can see how that can be somewhat confusing to participants if they've got to choose among 50 different funds. We also asked a question about what types of investment vehicles offered, and that chart is on the left-hand side. And you can see that most plans are using mutual funds, probably over 90%. Although some are starting to look at separate accounts and collective trusts as well. So I am going to talk a little bit more about that in later slides, but at this point we actually have another question because we want to hear from the audience what type of investment vehicles does your plan offer other than mutual funds? So does your plan offer collective trusts or white label manager of managers or use separate accounts? So we're tallying these up, and actually we see that there are a good 60%, well 50% are using some separate accounts. There are plans out there that are using white label funds, and there are plans out there using collective trusts. So a good cross array of different participants out there, different plan sponsors, and the use of these different types of vehicles. And we're going to get into a little bit more detail on that as we go through this part of the presentation. So I'll leave that up for a minute. The next slide I want to talk about is, remember we talked about the fact that, the survey showed that whether you have 10, 20, 30 different core options in there, that could be very confusing for participants. But the real reality is that when you even have 20 or 30 different fund options, the real truth is that most participants only use 3 to 4 of them. So the idea here is that having a more streamlined approach to your fund options is probably a good idea because most participants don't use more than 3 or 4 of them. And they definitely don't rebalance over time, only about 7% do, and they rarely use any new options. So looking at the usage of your options versus the number of funds in your lineup is probably a good idea and one of the best practices that we actually espouse. So now we're going to talk about the fund lineup from the asset allocation standpoint. The first thing I want to talk about is actually constructing the lineup. The idea here is that you want to get a fund or a manager that represents an asset class so that participants who want to make that decision on doing asset allocation can get a diversified portfolio. So what are asset classes? Asset classes are broad categories of investments that have very similar risk and return characteristics, and they're usually characterized by the types of securities such as, the financial instrument, whether it's a stock or a bond, by market capitalization, by maturity. So there's a number of different things that are similar to a specific asset class. The major ones are the cash, fixed income, and equities. And we'll talk about some non-traditional ones as well. So why do you want a fund lineup that has a number of different asset classes? Well, some of you may be very familiar with the periodic chart of returns, and this represents different asset classes, and they're color-coded. And what you see is that, the colors kind of go in and out of favor. And the idea here is that if you have a diversified portfolio, you are not sort of stuck in one area where you may have an underperforming asset class in one year and then an outperforming the next year, and you are actually at the mercy of the markets. So let's say, for example, if you look at 2011, down at the third from the bottom, the small cap value actually had a return of negative 5.5%. In 2012, however, it rebounded, and it was an 18% return. So if you had a portfolio that had some exposure to small cap, but also some exposure to large cap and to bonds, you'd have a diversified portfolio, and you wouldn't have all your eggs in one basket. That is the reason for actually having a lineup that actually covers a number of different asset classes. One of the fund options I would like to talk about is the Stable Value Fund. Many plans have the Stable Value Fund. And what is the Stable Value Fund? It's primarily a fixed income portfolio that is wrapped by an insurance contract, and the idea is to protect interest rate volatility. And how it does that is this wrapper actually amortizes any of the gains and losses of the portfolio to smooth out the returns. Many people seek this type of fund option for principal preservation. It typically does have higher returns than money market funds, and the idea here is that this is probably one of the most conservative options that you can offer in your fund lineup. Many plans, however, do have both a money market and a stable value, and that gets a little bit confusing for participants. So the best practice is to have one or the other, and really the stable value does offer the higher return. Let's talk about domestic equity. Domestic equity is your U.S. stocks. They can be distinguished by market capitalization, whether it's large cap or small cap, whether it's active or passive, passive being that it just replicates the index, active where you actually have a manager who actively manages it and you expect them to outperform the index, or by style, whether it's growth stocks versus value stocks. Growth stocks being like technology stocks, value stocks being more like utility stocks. So you can actually distinguish among the different equity funds by these types of things. However, best practice is to actually take a look at how you implement it so that you're not going to have a proliferation of a number of different equity funds. And one way to do that is to actually offer a passive large cap core, so like, for example, a S&P index fund, because the large cap area really is a very efficient market. It's very difficult for investment managers to beat the S&P. But the inefficient markets, like the mid cap and the small cap, that's where you can actually employ some active management. So having a large cap core index and then having active managers in the mid cap and small cap space. When you looked at the fixed income, you can also distinguish them by both a core approach or a specialty approach. The core would be like treasuries and corporate bonds. Specialties would be things like high yield, international, and emerging market fixed income. And again, best practice is not to have a proliferation of fixed income funds to cover all of these areas, but to use a total return fund where you have the majority of it being in a core component with small discretionary allocations to high yield and international bonds. And you leave it up to the manager to make the decision as to the high yield and international bond allocation. The next slide takes a look at the international area. And in international, again, you can distinguish the international equities, again, by capitalization and their exposure to the countries and regions and to the currencies. And here again, you can take a look at it as a core versus specialty. The core would be your developed markets, which are basically in the EFA index. But you can also have some small cap and mid cap equities, and you can have some emerging market equity as well. Now again, because what you're trying to do is streamline your lineup, you don't necessarily want to have a core approach for international plus specialty ones for each one of these areas. One way to implement that is to actually have a core with some actual allocation to small cap and or mid cap and or emerging markets. And again, it would be the manager who has maybe a flexibility to go 5 or 10% into these other specialty areas. Non-traditional asset classes. So these are things like TIPS, inflation-protected securities, real estate, commodities, and international fixed income. Now, do I see non-traditional asset classes in defined contribution plans? In some instances, I do, and especially when we get into sort of the white label and some of the separate account area. However, because of some of the volatility issues, like in commodities, or the liquidity issues, like in real estate, they are sometimes very hard to implement as a standalone basis. What some plans have done is they've actually used REITs as a substitute for real estate. And that could be a substitute for real estate. And when we're talking about real estate, we're talking about direct real estate there. However, REITs actually act much more like small cap equity stocks. So when small cap is not in favor, REITs will also get hammered by the market. Commodities can be somewhat very volatile as a standalone, and so sometimes it's very difficult for participants to actually get engaged with a commodities fund. And probably the best practice is to actually use what we call a diversified real asset fund. And this is a type of fund where it actually invests in things like oil and gold and commodities, and you have a manager that actually allocates among those different asset classes and gives the participant exposure to those, but actually the manager is making the call on how much that should be allocated to each of those specialty areas. The next area I want to talk about is the pre-diversified funds. And you know these as target date funds, target risk funds, or even maybe just a balanced account. And it really is just a single option that offers a fully diversified portfolio. And as you probably know, they are the most common default option. It typically has a glide path associated with it, usually done by age, so there's a roll down to more fixed income. But what we are seeing in the larger plans is that many of these target date funds can be customized to reflect the demographics and the saving patterns of your own employee population. We are also seeing that when you customize target date funds, you can actually add some of those non-traditional asset classes, like real estate or commodities or TIPS, and you can actually use that as part of the portfolio. So the idea here is to try to get a target date fund that sort of aligns with your employee population and when you expect them to retire. What the DOL has actually come out with is some tips on how do you review target date funds, and that is something that plan sponsors are actually going to have to take a look at in the future. So the things that the Department of Labor is taking a look at is they want you to take a look at different asset classes, again, looking at what the makeup is of those target date fund or target risk funds. What are the sub-asset classes? You know, how much is associated with U.S. versus equity? Is it over-diversified? For example, is a target date fund have 29 underlying fund options in there? And also looking at the vendors. Are there situations where there might be too many proprietary funds involved in the target date fund? On the structural part, the Department of Labor's tips basically say they want you to take a look at the roll-down process, and they also want you to take a look at how it's implemented, whether it's active or passive, and to look at the fee issue. And then again, how frequently is it rebalanced, whether it's on a quarterly or an annual basis. So these are some of the things as a fiduciary you need to take a look at when you have target date funds in your plan. So that's kind of this best practices fund lineup. Now I'm going to go into some special investments and taking a look at 3 different areas that we've touched on before. The first one is what we call white label funds. And the idea behind a white label fund is really sort of have a manager of managers. And it's interesting because you get 2 different views of this. From the plan sponsor view, they're basically trying to simplify the lineup. So instead of having, for example, a Fidelity Large Cap Growth Fund, you're going to have the XYZ County Fund. And that fund is actually, the participant, what they're going to see is the Equity Large Cap Fund. So they only have to make one decision about that particular asset class. But what is interesting is that the white label actually allows the plan sponsor to actually construct a fund that not only has the different styles, growth and value, but also has a passive core element to it. And so you do get some cost efficiencies there. Now, the idea behind this is that the plan sponsor is going to be taking on a lot more responsibility, types of funds, but the plan participant actually sees only that, as I showed in the prior slide, only the one asset class, which makes it easy for them to make decisions. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons of the white label fund. So why do you do this? It is complicated, but you do it because it is much more flexible. It tends to allow the plan sponsor to optimize the portfolio. And what's the key issue here is that you can actually replace some of the underlying managers in that setup without any disruption. The cons are that not all the record keepers will support this. There are some challenges in setting it up. The plan sponsor is responsible for rebalancing, and there are more enhanced governance issues that the fiduciary has to deal with. The next item is the managed accounts. And as Jeff alluded to, managed accounts are growing in popularity with defined contribution plans. What's interesting is on the managed accounts, it is one of the DOL default options that were named. Again, Jeff kind of covered this. It's an independent third party that provides online service. It's kind of a one-on-one, so you sort of get your own personalized financial planner. It is really geared for investors where they want to have a full array of asset classes in there, but they don't want to take care of it. They really want the professional management of it. So about a third of large plan sponsors do offer managed accounts, but only less than 5% do offer it as a default. What are the pros and cons? Well, the pros are that there's definitely professional management. You have a manager actually managing the assets for you. You can actually leverage the funds within the plan. And what's good about this type of thing is that the advice can actually extend down to the drawdown so that you can get some advice on how to actually take the money out of the plan and how you need to do that. The cons are the fees can be a bit prohibitive. They can be as high as, say, 1%. They're only as good as the input the participant puts in. So again, if you've got participants who do not want to, quote, be bothered with doing a lot of this work, this is probably not the one. The next one is the self-directed brokerage, and this is the idea here where we have 2 different types. We have the full window, which includes all individual securities, ETFs, all mutual funds, so that participant has a full array of decisions that they can make among all of these different types of investment vehicles. The limited window is typically only has mutual funds in it. Both of them are typically administered through some kind of a brokerage and don't necessarily become part of the record-keeping system because there are separate entities that are executing the trades and preparing the statements. Some of the pros and cons of the self-directed brokerage. Well, as I mentioned before, self-directed brokerage are for those participants who really want to have the full discretion. So it allows the investments for the vocal minority of the do-it-yourselfers. And where this really comes into play is the idea that when you're trying to streamline the different fund options, say you have those 30 or 40 different fund lineups and you want to get it down to a more manageable 18 or 19, what you can do is you can create a self-directed brokerage option, because then you can give access to all the participants for those funds that are no longer in the core options. The cons are there's costs associated with it, and there typically is low utilization. In fact, what we see is that even as far as 2014, that there was pretty much about only 5% of the participants are actually using the self-directed brokerage accounts. The next question has to do with the pros and cons of collective trusts. And you answered the polling question, and there were some participants and plan sponsors out there that have collective trusts in their plan. So what are some of the pros? First of all, what is a collective trust? Well, a collective trust is a commingled vehicle. It is actually maintained by a bank. It does not have a ticker symbol like a mutual fund does. There's no board of directors. It's not registered with the SEC. But it is pretty much under the scrutiny of the bank and the comptroller. So the pros of using a collective trust is that they have a tiered fee schedule. And so the idea there is you're getting some cost efficiencies. There's also fewer mutual fund issues. For example, the idea of transaction penalties and registration costs, none of that actually applies to these collective trusts. And what is interesting is that because of the popularity of collective trusts, Morningstar and Lipper, who is obviously doing a good job of covering all the mutual funds, they've actually increased their coverage of collective trusts. Also, many of the collective trusts are now producing their fact sheets and disclosure statements for their own collective trust, so you don't have to deal with the whole issue of having to do a customized disclosure statement. So that's some of the pros and cons. Probably the biggest con is the fact that usually revenue sharing is not always available for this type of fund, this type of investment vehicle. Some of you also answered that there are separate accounts in your plan. And again, the idea behind a separate account is the idea that the plan actually owns that portfolio of securities. What is good about a separate account? Again, it provides the lowest fee for large plans because of that tiered schedule. So the more money you have, the less percentage you pay. You can have customized investment policy guidelines. So for example, if you want to impose some socially responsible or sustainable type guidelines, you can actually do that for that type of portfolio. It does give you access to a greater set of investment managers, institutional investment managers. And because most plan sponsors have a DB plan where they do use plan managers that are separate accounts, you can actually piggyback on those managers and get the cost efficiencies from that. The cons are you do need to get some customized fact sheets for disclosure. There's a lot of moving parts. It's not something you can look up on the paper. There's typically no revenue sharing, and there's typically high minimums. But probably the biggest issue is the more governance that you have to take over for looking at these different funds. And also you have to hire somebody to do the unitization so that it actually looks like a mutual fund on the actual portal. So the next slide just kind of shows that in accordance with sort of the answers to the polling question, you can see that most plans in this NAGDA survey that was held in March, 71%, they had at least one fund that had either a separate account or a collective trust or some kind of unitized private label. The majority are still using mutual funds, but what we do see is that DC plans are definitely growing and they are evolving. And we do think that in the future, we will see more of these types of investments in the defined contribution plans. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to Steve to answer any questions.
All right, thank you. So at this time, I just want to remind you, you may submit questions. I saw we got one there through your web console. First thing I want to do is sincerely apologize for the technical difficulties. We apologize for that, and we'll certainly look to continue to improve in the future. So our apologies for that. For the Q&A session, just simply locate the question and answer panel on the top right-hand side of your screen. Type your question in the open area and click Send to Submit. And we have also provided our contact information for all of us in case you want to reach out to us. Jeffrey, during one of your presentations there, Galen Bath had a question. Is it 15 years or 20 years for residential? Are you in a position to be able to respond to that?
I have to look. I thought it was 20 years, but I may have been mistaken. So can I take that away as a to-do?
Yeah, if you could take that back and then maybe reach out to Galen, that would be fantastic.
Sure.
Okay, good deal. I'm not seeing any other questions. Tracy and Liz, is that accurate? Hopefully. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and it's past 2 o'clock. I'm gonna wrap it up. And first of all, don't forget to complete the webcast evaluation, which will open at the end of this webcast. In addition, within the next 7 or so business days, this program will be archived out on NAGDA's website for access by today's participants. So thank you so much for participating, and many thanks to the speakers. We certainly appreciate them for sharing their time and expertise with us today. Have a great week. Most importantly, have a great holiday season with your loved ones, and enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your week. Take care, everyone. We'll see you.